All right. Thank you very much, everyone, for being here today, and welcome to the third day of Decolonizing Economics, the third annual post-capitalism conference. We are so grateful to have you all with us. My name is Nicola Walters, and I am the summit coordinator for this event, though this conference is really the culmination of an incredible group of people. It is co-anchored by the Wiyot Tribe, uh, co-anchored by Cooperation Humboldt, and faculty at Cal Poly Humboldt. So you see a lot of colleagues of mine here in this room from Cal Poly Humboldt assisting with this conference. Our decision to focus on decolonizing economics has resulted in some powerful panels and presentations over 3 days. This focus has been the result of deepening relationships between the co-anchors of the summit, and we are so thankful to have the opportunity to convene around this focus. Decolonizing economics is a lens for this conference as well as a challenge, asking us to look beyond the ways of moving towards post-capitalism while also recognizing the way that colonization works in tandem with capitalism. We put forward this focus and this challenge to think about what our relationships will look like as we decolonize economics and build the future that we all deserve. So this conference serves as a space for us to look for ways for individuals and institutions to create the infrastructure and practices to address economic disparities, often requiring us to protect and restore the land and water, redistribute wealth towards marginalized communities, invest in the solidarity economy, and co-create really concrete next steps for how we implement cooperative economic practices in our own communities. And these themes that we're exploring are definitely and critically woven into our labor organizing work in education. And so it is with so much pleasure that I present our next panel, Labor and Organizing in Higher Education. The focus of this panel in particular is to provide a foundation for understanding the current conditions of higher ed labor, specifically the working conditions of 29,000 educators in the California State University system, represented by the California Faculty Association. We want to be looking at the intersections of anti-racist and social justice work and the opportunity to reimagine better working and learning conditions in academia. CFA, an organization that I'm also a member and organizer with, emphasizes decolonization in the framework of our work, recognizing the responsibility to acknowledge and make visible our relationships as settlers in relationship with Indigenous peoples. And through our member-led caucuses and councils, we aim to address the intersectional and diverse identities and experiences of CSU faculty and the way in which we can transform our working and learning conditions in education. So we have CFA leaders joining us today. A quick little overview of who we have with us. We have a full party, if you will, of folks, and I'm so grateful for everybody's participation. You can read more about people's individual bios on our website, but we're joined by Dr. Cesar Barca, who's a community organizer, scholar, activist, and urban farmer. He's an associate professor and MSW director in the social work department at Cal Poly Humboldt, and the Humboldt chapter of CFA, the representative for the California Faculty Association's Council on Racial and Social Justice. We have here Dr. Michelle Ramos Berlicia, who is an associate professor of California State University San Marcos and the co-founder of University Without Borders. Michelle is the California Faculty Association San Marcos eBoard chapter president, as well as the co-chair of the CFA Chicanx Latinx statewide caucus. Chris Cox is an educator and a union activist with more than 20 years of experience teaching in public higher education in California. He has taught sociology and global studies in community colleges in the South Bay area, as well as in the CSU system. He has been an active member of the CFA for more than for many years, and currently serves as the Associate Vice President for the Council of Racial and Social Justice North. We also have members of our Palestine, Arab, and Muslim caucus, Alam Mutaseb and Ali Kashani. Our PAM caucus, which is the acronym for the Palestine, Arab, and Muslim caucus. These members support and collaborate with CSU faculty, students, and staff who are targeted for harassment, censure, or censorship based on their research, teaching, or advocacy on justice for Muslims, Arabs, and/or Palestine. PAM provides a safe and dedicated space to educate and act in coalition with other Council of Racial and Social Justice caucuses on issues that impact Muslim bans on CSU faculty, students, and staff, violence with campus policing, and the need for us to have integrity and intellectual expertise around our ethnic studies requirement in the CSU, among other things that they will introduce as well. And our CFA leaders are also joined by Joe Barry and Helena Worthen, who are instrumental to this discussion. Joe and Helena are authors of Power Despite Precarity, through which they explore the 30-year struggle of CSU lecturers to negotiate what has been recognized as one of the strongest contracts for contingent laborers in the United States. Helena Worthen got involved with AFT Local while teaching writing for at least 7 different colleges or universities in the San Francisco Bay Area before getting a job with Unite in Philadelphia, where she learned about work in the private sector, the garment industry, and globalization. She's a prize-winning author, and one of the books which I mentioned before, Power Despite Precarity, she wrote with Joe Barry, where they have been really instrumental to helping us to be thinking about the political education that we're all facing. But Joe Barry himself has been active in major higher ed unions as a member, elected leader, paid staffer, and labor educator, is also the author of Reclaiming the Ivory Tower, Organizing Adjuncts to Change Higher Education, and as co-author with Helena there as well. So without further ado, I want to pass it over to our presenters, first to Joe Barry and Helena Worthen, to really help us to dive into that history and understanding the foundation of what is being faced in California in higher education.
Thank you very much. I should also add that since this has become a bit of a CFA party, Helena and I both taught briefly, me very briefly, and Helena less briefly in the CSU system, and are former members of the CFA as well. Myself at San Francisco State and her at Sonoma State. So we appreciate being invited to the party. As background, I have discovered as a labor studies person that a great many people are interested in the history of what they do and their own profession, but don't know very much about it. And it isn't part of the normal training in most professions, and education is no exception. So as a way of centering some of this conversation, want to talk a little bit about the history of the transitions that we posit that have taken place in higher education in the United States, and look at it not from the way that most education history or history in general is taught, which is from the top down, from the powerful acting upon the systems and the powerless majority, but rather from the bottom up, from the point of view of the people who did the work and how the work impacted the much larger group of people that we were working upon, as it were, students and fellow workers and the society as a whole. Higher education first became a major factor in US history really in the 19th century. Before that, it was largely the training of ministers was where it came from. And then with independence, some more focus on training of people to be self-governing. But the first huge transition in higher education that we posit was toward the end of the latter part of the 19th century and early part of the 20th century, a move under the pressures of the Industrial Revolution and the creation of the industrial capitalist class, and by extension, the creation of the industrial working class, the need by the capitalists for a much greater number of people trained to be their managers, right? So it created higher education was, but the higher education that existed then was not sufficient to that task, because it was so dispersed and so decentralized and so non-standardized that it was impossible for these leaders of new national corporations, especially in transportation, resource energy, and finance, those particular sectors in particular, you could say Rockefeller, Morgan, and Gould, or whoever. Pullman too. Yeah, right. So they needed a standardized system, and they did it. In most countries, standardization took place uh, through government action, but in the United States, it took place through private action, just like the standardization of the width of the tracks in railroads. Uh, and, uh, and that standardization gave us much of what we still face in higher education, the so-called Carnegie Unit from the Carnegie Commission. Carnegie, of course, being Andrew Carnegie, the steel magnate and owner of the Homestead Mill, where the famous Homestead strike was smashed with murders. So that gave us then later, the standardization of faculty, the growth, the development of TIA, CREF as a national insurance retirement fund, and the College Board and the SATs. All of these grew out of this national standardization. The next great transition, and the other thing that happened in this standardization was a whole lot of smaller, less well-endowed institutions bit the dust, especially those that were particularly serving Black people and women. So it was not just a standardization, it was a shrinkage toward the center of power, and a cutting out of the edges as national regulations of various sorts of corporations and other things have often done in the past. Because of course, the people involved being standardized had a lot of say in how this played out. The expansion is the next one that I want to talk about, which really took place especially during and after World War II. That was the next great transition in higher education. Whereas the faculty under the standardization model was almost all upper middle class and upper class white men, almost exclusively. Even during that little blip of time in the late 19th century, when you had more than an insignificant number of women going to college and then not finding jobs because no man would hire a college-educated woman, which contributed to the growth of the women's suffrage movement and many other things that people are probably familiar with. But even with that blip, the educators the higher educators, faculty were overwhelmingly that, and that conflict created the change. Now, the expansion after World War II came again because forces on the top needed a change. They needed something different. They needed something different than what was being provided before. And what they needed was access to higher education by a larger number of people. And also they needed to keep a bunch of people out of the labor force for fear of the Depression coming back. And so the GI Bill was the answer to that. And that provided openings for humongous numbers of people to get jobs in higher education. For about a 20-year period, anybody with an advanced degree beyond baccalaureate degree could get a job teaching in higher education and could choose their job. People were hired on the telephone, sight unseen, on the basis of one trusted person's recommendation in a letter all the time. It was a huge expansion, but it wasn't even. It was disproportionately white men because the GI Bill was such that you could get supported and a stipend to go to college any place that you could get in. Well, a lot of colleges had quotas against Jews, had limitations on what women could do, and total exclusions of Black and Latino people. And given the situation of Native peoples in the United States, they weren't even factored in. There were no Native colleges and there were almost no Native students. But this expansion nevertheless allowed a lot of people, a lot of white men, and working class men, The most famous example of this, probably individually, is Howard Zinn, who was who came from a poor working class Jewish family in New York, had been a World War II veteran, and then became a professor and a mentor to many of the people involved in the next great transition of higher education, the movement, right? So while it created a sprinkling, because some of these people got into graduate school and got into the pool of people who could be hired as professors. Not a huge number, but enough that they could sprinkle the mentorship into the next generation as their children came of age in the late 50s and 60s. The children who became the baby boom children, right? The children that were born in the years right after the war, myself as one of them, they were expected to go to college, even by parents who didn't themselves in many cases. And people were banging on the walls. And they were also banging on the walls to change those walls. So both internally and externally, there were tremendous forces on the university that forced change in access and change in content. Both, the most famous example is the San Francisco State strike for both access, change in the faculty composition against the firing of Black faculty members, and support and access for students, students of color who had been largely outside of higher education, kept out, and changes in the curriculum, the development of the first whole school of not just a department, but a whole school of ethnic studies, which persists despite various attempts over the years to degrade and get rid of it. The movement was the third great transition, and it resulted in a large number of non-traditional people getting the qualifications to be faculty members, right? To get into graduate school and get graduate degrees. This created a number of problems, which Helena will discuss as she talks about how the next transition impacted us all. But it changed the faculty composition, the pool of faculty, and that was important. So in each one of these cases, I would argue that you've got the faculty itself changing, the workforce changing. You've got conflicting forces interacting over the new demands being placed on higher education, what it should do, who we should do it for, and who should do it. And that dialectic created a transition to a partially, not wholly, but a new system, not just additive or subtractive from what was before, a dialectic. The next transition, I would argue, was what we call the neoliberal contraction that took place starting in the early 70s, partly mainly from forces way outside the university that caused a ruling class strategy to be changed from the social democratic or liberal compromises of the post-World War II period between capital and labor to a much more aggressive anti-labor marketization, everything through the market, hence the word neoliberal, as in the old liberal idea that everything should be marketized and that there shouldn't be the old feudal restrictions. That's where the old liberalism came from, to neoliberal, the new liberal, under the new conditions of virtually universal capitalism and wage labor worldwide. And that impacted the university and colleges and all of higher ed hugely. Higher ed now was, of course, different. The majority of higher ed was now working class students in community colleges. and public state universities, many of which had started out as teachers' colleges, like many of the California State University system. So that change now resulted in some real problems for administrators, lower level administrators, and Helena will be talking about those problems and how casualization was posited in practice, not necessarily thought out completely, but posited in practice as being at least a partial solution to those problems in one of the early ones. The last thing I want to say, I think, have I gone over my 10 minutes?
You're right there, but don't go for it. Joe, what's your last piece?
The last thing I want to say was that each one of these transitions is one that we can learn something from the process more than the individual content. The process of class conflict, if you will, very complicated, the recomposition of the forces involved. And if we can tease out the generalizations from that, we may be able to have some impact on what we posit as the fifth transition that we're in now, and that we need to actively shape for ourselves, for our students, and for the society that higher education sits in, and what kind of a society it's going to be.
Well, thank you so much, Joe, for laying that first piece for us. And I know that Helena will pick up and fill in some more of those aspects for us now.
Great. Am I muted?
Yep, we can hear you just fine.
Okay. We're gonna overlap a little bit, which is fine. And I'm going to share my screen so that I can do my PowerPoint. Joe ended with the fourth transition, the neoliberal contraction. What we want you to be doing is thinking about how the faculty is changing right now, and how new demands are being made on higher education, and what forces are in play. And then we need you to be foreseeing what the next transition is going to be like. You can see that these transitions don't necessarily reflect what came immediately before. Each one is something new. And so what we are going to see in the next 5 or 10 years may be very different from what we have come from. But this group of people here, the people I'm looking at right now on Zoom, are the important people for figuring out what that is going to be. So I'm going to flip through some of these slides because I know we're being recorded, so I don't have to read them out loud. I'll bet you remember what the new demographic was like in the 1970s and what the demands were that were placed upon higher ed. Down at the bottom of the slide, student services, the remediation, the language labs. I mean, this is something that you have all had to deal with. And these things, we're talking about the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, managers faced 4 problems. They were facing cutbacks in funding, the unpredictable student enrollment. They could no longer simply say how many people are graduating from high school this year, therefore we need so many English classes. Faculty unionization is rising, which limits management control and flexibility. They had to try to get ahead of that. And then the people who were coming into the faculty workforce didn't look like white men anymore. Many more African Americans, minorities, women. I'm one of those. So the response to all of this turned out to be casualization. How did casualization turn out to solve all of these problems at once? It solved the funding cutbacks by lowering labor costs, by paying faculty on a per class basis at very, very low wages. I was earning less than $3,000 per class when I when I got started, and that was actually pretty good compared to other people. Second problem, the unpredictable enrollment. If you have unpredictable enrollment, you can hire faculty semester by semester. You can have them start a class and then cancel it 2 weeks into the class if there aren't enough people enrolled, or if there's too great a dropout rate. You don't have to have anything like a career track. Third problem, the threat of rising unionization. The solution to that is to maximize the dividing and conquer. Try to define bargaining units as narrowly as possible and magnify the distinctions between in status, so that somebody walking down the hallway to their office who has a key to that office is automatically somebody who holds more prestige and authority than somebody who's carrying 3 big cloth bags on her way to her second job of the day. I mean, those are status symbols that have a tremendous emotional impact and work to make it very hard for faculty to make bridges across those status differences. And then the faculty is less white, more female, more BIPOC. The solution is to take advantage of the vulnerability of this workforce to delay and discourage support. Now, when you have a single solution that not locks down more than one problem at a time, it becomes very hard to unlock. Back in the 80s and 90s, faculty unions, especially part-timer, adjunct, contingent, temporary faculty unions, were trying really hard to just get a little job security. And they found that it was really almost impossible. You could easily bargain wages better than you could bargain any kind of job securities. And that was partly because we saw this as we didn't understand that there were really 4 problems that had to all be unlocked. We kind of thought we could take it one problem at a time and not realize that the other locks would still be sitting there. So when you turn those problems around and ask, for whom are these actually problems, you get a different story. The first one, funding. There is not enough money. We know there is enough money. I don't think anyone in this Zoom is going to imagine that there's not enough money floating around being spent on stupid things. Flexibility. Is it possible to create schedules that accommodate actual needs? Yes, we know that can be done. You don't have to solve flexibility by making people precarious workers. Unionization, we don't think that unionization is actually a threat. We think that it's actually a way to have a stable, accountable partner in shared governance. And diversity, it may be a problem from some point of view, but in fact, it's a requirement, not a problem. So you turn these problems around and ask from the point of view of the workforce or the students or the working class, are these actually problems? No, they're not problems. We have ways to deal with this. So the question that we're asking is, what's the strategy for dealing with all of this? We are now 75% of all the faculty in the United States. And the campus labor movement is the hottest part of the labor movement. Students and faculty are united in anger about the cost of higher education, the difficulty of getting in, as the California, Joe and I have grandchildren who are applying to the CSUs right now. And so we know whereof we speak. And student debt has flamed up over and over again as a cause of great rage. There is also a new organization, HALU, Higher Education Labor United, which you are probably all aware of, that is in the process of organizing itself right now. It's in the middle of going from being a kind of massive network with 131 endorsers and a summer summit and a winter summit and a terrific platform. it's going from that kind of amorphous stage to solidifying itself with an actual budget and a set of bylaws and an internal structure. We need to think of this as a global problem, not a US problem. One of the things that Joe has been working on very heavily is the Coalition of Contingent Academic Labor, which Chris Cox has also been involved in that. And I'm hoping that he'll be going to Mexico this summer. We should make sure that the other people on this panel are going to be with us there. And then finally, the climate crisis is real. You know, one of the crises of higher education is that there are actually people who don't believe in science, and all the anti-intellectualism that has made it, has revealed our inability to deal with pandemics, of which there will be more. So there's a clock ticking on this transition. And we need to figure out, and we are looking to you guys to figure out how to develop a strategy that can be implemented that will take us into the next transition and get us over this hump. So
thank you so much, Helena and Joe, really in helping to get us kicked off and thinking about some of the conditions that we're all facing. Now we're taking it to a little bit of a more specific level of what's been happening on our campuses and within the California Faculty Association. So I'll pass it over to Cesar.
Thank you, Nicola, for this opportunity. As I was asked to be in this panel, I was looking for inspiration to how to kind of break down and kind of construct this corporate model. And as you can see in my background, I have the flag of the United States with all the corporate logos to kind of signify that that's the kind of the stage that we're in, not only as Earth, but also in the United States. So I was thinking about Bell Hooks and her grounding in white supremacist patriarchy analysis, and obviously the big context is capitalism, and kind of thinking about the systems of dominations. And for some of us who come from community organizing and grassroots, the way in which the university operates is not a surprise, because we think it's a contested space. Like ideology of corporate top-bottom systems do apply, even as more diversity happens. And another thing that I want to emphasize is that our personal experience matters, because as we're speaking about these major themes about, you know, the changes of demographics, I am representing that demographic shift. And I'm sure as a product of public education, public, K-12 school, community college, attending San Francisco State, and then attending a private university to do my PhD at Boston University, I got to learn the disparity in resources and investment in the future. And this whole discourse that education is a kind of an engine for change and social mobility is mythology. And it really doesn't apply to some of us who are coming into this space. And I think that's where this resonates, what Joe was saying about standardization, because for us, especially in social work, that is my discipline, the code work has become, and part of the ideology is professionalization, right? So now we are professions, now we are professionals, so therefore we should be attending to industry and corporate interests more than to the people that we're supposed to be serving. So that kind of resonates a lot to me. And when Helen is talking about this shift in investment, for a lot of us is real, because I don't believe that when I was at San Francisco State, my professors ever preoccupied to have a discussion about how much burden student loans were for them, but they are a burden to me. So I'm starting like in the basement of social mobility, even with a PhD in a tenure profession. So, as we see an increase on tuition, we don't see that translated in better educational conditions for students. We don't see that translated in better wages for faculty, whether it's tenure or lecturers or even support staff. It's the opposite. We see this wealth disparity in the nation being reflected in the wealth disparity between administration and line, frontline people in the university. So those conditions continue to exist. And definitely the burden of student loans is something very, very present in the mind of our students and the mind of ourselves as faculty, as we coming along with the promise that if you get the PhD, if you just go to the next level, you will be rewarded, but it's kind of a delayed reward because you have to pay those student loans. So as contested spaces as well, we thinking about this conservative ideology coming from the far right, the criticism on, gender and sexual orientation, the contested of critical race theory, and the different, kind of discourses that are kind of attacking our academic freedom. I don't recall my professors ever being worried about them addressing some of these issues of wealth disparity, racial disparity, racism, wealth inequality in a way that we have to worry about nowadays, where now our names can appear in websites, can we appear in social media, and we can be attacked for the ideas that we share in the classroom. And I think that's something that it has changed, that now we have the burden. So I want to switch to one major issue that I want to share with you in my time, which is cultural taxation. Cultural taxation is a condition that exists in many, many fields, particularly in academics, because uneven reflection of diversity in a student body. I teach at Cal Poly Humboldt that it is continued to be a predominantly white institution. We have become a so-called Hispanic service institution, which means about 35% or more of our students are Chicano Latino, but that's not reflected in the faculty. So that means that I have to pay an extra tax, an extra burden to be able to provide support and direct mentorship to students of color, even if they're not within my department or my major. So I have the responsibility to make sure that the students that come to Humboldt, they get the support they need so they can continue to, to academic and professional path. And think about it, this is a huge burden for some of us that have to pay that is not equally, distributed among the university. And this is a term that was developed by a scholar in the 1994, Amado Padilla, who really described this uneven, disparity that exists about, faculty of color. And I think that's where this, although I don't think in linear ways, about these transformations that we see in academia. And I don't know, maybe we are in the 7th transformation. I don't know, I lose track of the number, but definitely you can feel the neoliberalism and the outsourcing of a lot of the programs and services in a university. Our university outsource the dining services that used to be jobs that a lot of students got and they were stateside. They have outsourced now the new idea is counseling services, mental health for students who much needed because of the pandemic and all the different pressures that they have to be into with their families and themselves to be able to go through higher education. So definitely the diversity in the faculty is still lacking. And that means that a lot of us are paying the price for entering these spaces who are ill-prepared to retain us and support us as faculty, let alone to do that to their students. So definitely a big change. So finally, I want to talk about the work that I've been doing with our local chapter with CFA Humboldt and being the representative for the Council for Racial and Social Justice. I think this is one of the spaces that kind of validates my experience as a faculty of color, as a Chicano professor, as a working class, because at the university, there's not a lot of spaces where this is validated. I think for a lot of folks who don't come from this background, getting involved in politics and union labor is kind of a not part of their class consciousness. And it is part of mine because it's validating my ability to fight back and my ability to recognize that not only the experience that I have in the university is impacting me, it's impacting my students, but it can also impact other cohort of faculty that's coming after me. So the fight that we're doing now is important for future faculty as well, because this is gonna go on even after I retire. So it's important for me to kind of invest now in changes that I want to accommodate and help others. So the student and faculty collaborations are very, very important. And our campus have been very, life-changing, getting involved with the students and serving undocumented and documented students, creating a student mural that we created with the students that I want to share a little picture of it, because I think it's one of those things that really emphasize what we can get done. This is a process that took us 2 years to do. There was no mural on campus that was student-led, and we started collaborating with the students and getting this done. And this is part of the quad, and some of you who've been in Humboldt that kind of exemplifies those collaborations between faculty and students. Definitely with CFA, one of the major projects that we've been collaborating over the years has been a student group within the structure of CFA called Students for Quality Education, which is similar to the Council of Racial and Social Justice, statewide, system-wide representation of the students who are engaged in labor and educational struggles and solidarity with faculty and students. So definitely a lot of collaborations and piggybacking around the issue of like, how do we improve the educational conditions for students, especially as we think about the lack of investment by the state of California. And just to finalize, my last one will be, this is a trend that also happens in other systems, such as medical. If you look at medical, as the diversity went up, with Chicano Latinos being enrolled, the investment went down. So similar to what happened with the CSU. So we see this pattern of the investment in the future of California as a pattern of this structural pushback on policies that are inclusive and supportive of people like me. So thank you for the time.
Thank you so much, Cesar. And I know that just laying that sort of key connection to all these other industries and the processes that are happening in California is actually really connected to what Michelle is hoping to speak about today. So I'll pass it over to you, Michelle. And thank you so much, Cesar.
Thank you, Nicola, and thank you, Cesar. Buenas tardes, me llamo Michelle Ramos Pellicia y soy profesora de lenguas en el Departamento de Lenguas Modernas. And I start in Spanish, although it's another colonial language, because it's another language that is spoken here in the US. And so I want to emphasize that as I emphasize how the work that we do in CFA as a labor union who's committed to anti-racism and social justice work also mirrors ourselves, right? And that change of education we want to see is to paint the ivory tower and all the colors to represent us. We want to have equitable, democratic, more diverse education, but going beyond diversity, we wanted that diversity to be able to have our space to interrogate, to disrupt, so that we can make that change. And so I want us to go beyond being consulted to collaborating and working towards that change. So when we're talking about anti-racism and social justice, we go beyond the typical bread and butter. We work on seeing ourselves as whole, as tridimensional, intersecting identities, where we are not only, the Boricua professor who's teaching Spanish, right? But as a person who has been a lecturer, has been a single mom, who has, still working in precarious conditions during the pandemic and so on. So I say this because as CFA, we have the space to develop campaigns as we're changing that higher education landscape, right? In interrogating power, and as a chapter president on my campus, I hear from lecturers, from counseling faculty, from librarians, from coaches, from tenure track faculty telling me about their experiences. And one thing that is very impactful among the many experiences that we hear is how, naming and seeing structures or murals or the lack of thereof of our culture, of our experiences impact us on a daily basis. So I'm here to tell you a bit about the work that we're doing in this campaign. This campaign is happening on our campus, and our campus is San Marcos. We are located in the borderlands, a little bit north of San Diego, but still in the borderlands. And the building is the administrative building that is behind me. in my background here in Zoom, and is memorializing a former California senator who was the chairperson of the legislature's Special Committee on Border Issues. This person led a head count or called for a head count to understand the financial impact of undocumented residents have on schools and public agencies in San Diego County. And this person also advocated for schools and healthcare facilities to turn in the undocumented residents of our region. This was around 1993, 1994, when Proposition 187 was passed, and he had a hand in all this. So also hand in hand with that, those actions, he also played an instrumental role in the foundation of in founding our university, our campus, San Marcos. So, people decided back then, we're going to name this building. However, faculty and staff and students in coalition worked to put together a movement so that this building wasn't named after this man. And the president back then resisted that. He was very good friends with the senator. And I don't name him because we already hear that name so often. This is a person that described migrant workers and undocumented workers as the lower rung of humanity, completely disrespecting the dignity of our undocumented workers. So, back in the 1990s, our faculty pushed, and they were threatened and retaliated with, you're not going to get tenure, but they still worked and pushed back along with staff and students who were also experiencing threats and retaliation. But here we are again, and we have passed a resolution. We're in task force, and we understand that this is not only particular to our campus, it is also a movement in statewide and in the CSU system, a national movement, and also worldwide. We are an HSI institution. 37% of our students are Latino, Chicanx. They identify as such. And this is a building where the Dreamer Resource Office is located, the EOP, camp, services that help our students succeed. However, it's also in a building that is named after a person who has done so much damage in our community. So our union, in our anti-racist and social justice work, we believe this is an actionable step that demonstrate that we stand with our undocumented, BIPOC, LGBTQIA, Native, and Palestinian, Arab, and Muslim. So, we are resolute in working towards change and working towards this name to be changed, and also creating a database and working for a change statewide, where buildings are actually a reflection, and that we have murals, that we have memorials that actually reflect our history ourselves. And we're also pushing for this building in particular to memorialize the region's native nation. So I'm talking specifically about Luiseño Payoca Huichol. So with that, I will end asking that you sign the petition. I know, Nicola, thank you. You drop it in the chat. This is also part of our labor union work. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michelle. We're just connecting all these pieces that a lot of times people think like labor has to be in this one category, but we're demonstrating that you don't stop these issues just by building a building. In fact, the way the buildings are built and represented and named and decorated and, filled by all of us is all part of what makes, our working and learning conditions. So I'll pass it over to Chris Cox.
I thank you. Hopefully you all can hear me. So thanks everybody for all the things coming that have been spoken already. And I do want to just kind of make a couple of nods to some of those things. Definitely want to thank Michelle for describing that process of building naming. And I just want to use it as a quick opportunity to talk about that process. I teach at San Jose State. I live in the city of San Jose, and up the street from me is a school that used to be named for California's first governor in the American period. And his name, I will name him, he's long dead, Peter Burnett. So it's not like he's going to get any Instagram hits or anything if you say his name. But one of the things that he wanted to do, he was originally from Tennessee, and his goal was actually to make California a slave state. And he wasn't successful at doing it. And so when he was not successful at doing it, he wanted to kick all Black people out of California. He also had similar ideas for Mexicans in California, right? And even at that, in that term, you know, given the fact that all of this used to be Mexico, it was very easy to try to demonize people, right? And use that as a basis for stealing people's land, stealing people's resources, right? Et cetera, as you know, if you know a little bit about California history. And so recently, one of the things that was a fight within the community that was successful was to take the name off of the middle school, take his name off of the school. And the school has successfully been named the Muwekma Ohlone Middle School. And it's named for the native indigenous people to whom this land belongs. And so I'm using that as kind of a long way to circumvent and to give some respect to the Muwekma Ohlone people on whose land I work, I teach, and I live. I want to just kind of give a few points to talk a little bit about, you know, in terms of the things that Joe and Helena talked about with a little bit of labor history. And so starting off, just a recognition that in the labor movement in the United States, pretty much like all things in the United States, race is a major factor. There is no way to talk about labor and to talk about labor as a movement without really acknowledging the fact that the kind of general racial history in the United States very much intersects with our labor history. And so I want to start off with a quote from William Edward Burghardt Du Bois, and his quote from Black Reconstruction in America in 1935, "The white worker did not want the Negro in his unions, did not believe in him as a man, dodged the question, and when he appeared at conventions, asked him to organize separately, that is, outside the real labor movement, in spite of the fact that it was a contradiction of all sound labor policy." Right? The reality is that as much as we can talk about the importance of the labor movement, especially in light of those various changes and transformations that Joe and Helena talked about, we cannot separate out the fact that there has been a basis of exclusion that has existed in the labor movement itself, and that has definitely existed in higher education. And so an example of that, you know, when we start to look at the AFL-CIO in the 20th century, actually before they merged, it was the CIO that was making a little bit more progress for Black workers. For Du Bois, by the year 1945, there were about 500,000 Black workers in the Congress of Industrial Organizations. And the AFL-CIO merged in about 1955, right? And so one of the things is that the CIO did start to change its tune because of the desire to organize in the South originally, and then recognizing that organizing workers in the South meant that you actually, if you want to really make progress, you needed to make that attempt to cross that racial line. Unfortunately, though, as many things happen in the United States, there was a lot of pressure on the CIO to renege on that plan to organize in the South. And during the McCarthy era, that was quite a strong pressure. You had unions like like NEA, the National Education Association, which has existed for quite a long time, but it also excluded Black workers. It was not an integrated union. And in fact, there was a different teachers union called the ATA, the American Teachers Association, that was started in 1907. And it integrated with NEA in the year 1966. And so there's this long history when it comes to labor organizing, unfortunately, of racial exclusion. And so when we start to ask questions, like one of the questions that, you know, kind of coming in regard to today's panel is looking at what is the relationship between labor and higher ed and our anti-racism and social justice work. And that relationship has to be an explicit one. It needs to be an explicit one because the history of racial exclusion has been a very explicit history. If we want to really think about having a strong, a powerful, and an inclusive labor movement, we cannot just assume that, well, you know, we had the Civil Rights Act in 1964, we've had a variety of pieces of legislation in the 1970s and 1980s to try to create greater racial equity, so we don't have to worry about it anymore, or we don't have to think about it. Or because we're all workers and we're all working in these same systems, the only basis of analysis that we need is a class basis. And all of those things are actually flawed. If we really want to have a strong ability to move forward, we need to do what some labor organizations have done in the past. And I'm going to talk about CFA in a moment. But actually, one of the things that started to happen in the 1960s with the AFL-CIO, as well as United Auto Workers, was formation of caucuses. And you started to get Black caucuses forming in those union groups starting, you know, in the 1960s. And part of the purpose of that is the recognition that in order for these labor unions to start to be more effective, you really have to address the real lived conditions of working people. And picking up on what Cesar was talking about earlier, you know, we are in higher ed where spaces for people who look like myself have not really been there for so long and so strong. The real working conditions, the real conditions, lived conditions of faculty of color, of LGBTQ+ faculty, are things that we actually have to consider if we want to be able to move forward and address the concerns that people have. So for example, we have, I can just talk about my campus a little bit over time. San Jose State was founded in 1857. It's been around, it was basically the oldest, considered the oldest public university on the West Coast. We have had over many years, you know, you start to look at the racial breakdown of our campus communities. The racial breakdown of our faculty has not ever really matched the racial breakdown of the communities that we serve. And that's one of those things that's a problem. You have over a long period of time, right? You have basically a way that we kind of reproduce the same realities over and over again. When we look at things like how do we hire, when we look at things like what kinds of actual conditions exist on campus for people who work on campus, we start to see that not only do we have problems with hiring faculty of color in many ways, but we definitely have problems with retention, with keeping people around. And it's the real conditions that we face in our day-to-day work that have an impact on the retention of faculty of color. The retention of faculty of color has a lot to do with what Cesar brought up, which is cultural taxation on our campuses, right? Looking at the ways in which faculty of color are taxed and burdened with extra work, extra tasks based on their own identity in relation to the identity of the students. And so when you have a small number of African-American faculty, for example, there is a greater burden on each of us to mentor students, to work with communities, and to engage in ultimately what amounts to a large amount of free labor. And so if you do not engage in that free labor when you're culturally taxed, you're oftentimes, you know, you're going to be, you know, there's some problems there, right? You're going to be looked at in certain ways. Number one, there's pressure from your own community to serve the community, which is understandable and it's very important, but it also sometimes people don't recognize how much of a burden it is on the same 2, 3, 4, 5 people being called over and over and over again. That happens oftentimes at the behest of administration as well. We have a program, we have this going on, we have that going on. All of a sudden, that's when every you know, not to be rude, but that's when all of a sudden every administrator knows your name. Because they can call you, right? And just to be clear, I'm a lecturer. I've been on my campus for 22 years as a lecturer. And so what you have is lots of faculty of color who are in lecturer positions that we are basically as lecturers oftentimes ignored and invisible until somebody wants something or until somebody needs something. There's a huge parallel, and given the fact that a lot of faculty of color are in lecturer ranks, you get that sense of, you know, you're not important to anybody until you want something or until you need something. Tying that into a little bit into the history of our union, it was members of our union that during the 1980s and 1990s started to create a committee that ultimately became what we call the Council for Affirmative Action. And part of the goal of that committee was to have a space within the union for faculty of color to come and express their concerns and to try to shape the ways in which the union itself is able to bargain and is able to just function, right, in ways that support its members. And so over time, what we started to see, it was the work of people coming together to form that Council for Affirmative Action. One of those folks being Dr. Cecil Canton, right, who was a longtime leader in CFA. And part of that, though, was creating a space where faculty of color in the Council for Affirmative Action not only had a space to come together to address their concerns, but also a space of leadership within the union. There was a recognition over time that if we really want things to change, and this I think is important for the broader union movement, if we really want things to change within our organization so that we can be more effective at helping faculty address their concerns, we actually have to have more inclusion when it comes to the voices of those who are making decisions, right? Because part of it is sometimes it is the ways in which our own experiences shape our thoughts, shape our approach to the work that we do, shape our understanding of what's going on around us, that we actually start to see a greater ability to problem solve. And so over time, though, what has happened is that we have gone beyond the needs of what was started with the creation of the Council for Affirmative Action. Now, that council was named in that way for a very specific purpose. And the reason it was named that way, it was in, I believe the year was 1996, when the CCRI was passed in California, basically banning affirmative action in higher ed. Right. And so they specifically chose the name Council for Affirmative Action to not lose sight of the goal, the broader goal, which is to create a more inclusive CSU. Right. And so now, though, what we see is that we've gone beyond that need. And it was a few years ago that we changed that, and we created it as the Council for Racial and Social Justice. And that is we've gone beyond some of the concerns that we had in the 90s, early 2000s, right, into addressing some of the greater concerns that we have today, right? We're seeing this dynamic of neoliberalism just get stronger and stronger and kind of, create this, corporate chokehold on higher education. And that's something that is definitely tied into issues of race, of class, of gender. I think Helena mentioned the environmental movement a while ago, right? And there are ways we're not going to make progress when we're looking at our environmental movement, right, to address climate change, if we don't also consider the role, the needs of diverse communities, if we don't consider the role that race and racial justice plays being tied together with climate justice, right? And so I don't want to take up any more time, so I'm not sure if I'm getting the signal from you, Nicola, but I just wanted to kind of leave it there and show that all those things are intertwined. And I think really the strength that we can create together collectively comes from our ability to respond as things in the society change, but to do so through organizing and through being able to kind of share our information, share ideas, share experiences, and come up with new ways to kind of push our society to really become the more equitable society that we desire to have. So thank you all.
Thank you so much, Chris. And also, you're just doing an expert job of weaving the trends and the themes of everyone's contributions to set us up for thinking about additional caucus work that has been critical to our union. And so I want to next send it over to our PAM representatives here to talk about some of the work of the caucus there. So I'll pass it over to y'all.
Hello, Ahla Muhtaseb from Cal State San Bernardino. And let me start by acknowledging that I'm joining you all from the indigenous unceded colonized lands of the Pichanga tribe of the Louisiana First Nation, and that I work also on the unceded colonized lands of the indigenous lands of the Serrano, Yohavitam First Nations. Thank you very much, Nicola, and the organizers for inviting us to this amazing space. And thank you very much for all the organizers for these wonderful interjections. I mean, I could actually make connections to every single one of those talks and share my experience as a woman of color myself, having to go through a lot of the things that had been mentioned intersectionally, of course, because of my layers and layers of suppression in academia. But I guess I was invited to talk about the PAM caucus of what Chris just described and explained, the Council on Racial and Social Justice, which we are proud that we became part of last year, not last year, but let's say last summer. We're a baby caucus, one of the newest ones. And actually this came as years and years of organizing and years of also suppression, similar to what Chris said, that we were to a great extent or had been marginalized and suppressed and erased to a great extent, especially Palestinian scholars, Palestinian students, and also, in general faculty who teach and research around Palestine. Also students who organize around Palestine, students who study around those issues. So this was a culmination really of years and years of that struggle. And just before COVID, at the end of 2019, we started thinking to creating this kind of like mini collective in the collective, because every time we tried to push for some statement against some of the oppressive Israeli practices against Palestinians, which trickled down, of course, to us through the Israeli lobby and its huge arms, we were actually not allowed really to push for any collective work or organizing around those issues. And some of this was motivated by different political dynamics, but some of it was, as I said, this notion of progressive on everything, on all except Palestine, for example, or it was motivated by really lack of knowledge on the intersectionality of the work, or thinking that this is an overseas issues, which is of course not true, because as I said, it's actually very intersectional. It's in the heart actually of the empire where we live in, and everything that happens there is really operated and enabled through our foreign policies and through our tax money and through a lot of intersectional systems of oppression. Including, of course, we could make the link to so many things, and I don't have the time to go over it, but like from border politics to police brutality, the fact that police is trained by Israeli forces, for example, all the way to the little details, including what is happening today on academia in terms of the new requirement of ethnic studies. Today, actually, I received an email from colleagues from the UC system who are now finalizing the ethnic studies requirement. They have a petition now that they are calling on us to support them, because among all the right-wing factors or factions that are fighting them now, also the Israeli lobby is very involved. The Amcha Initiative issued a statement against the inclusion of ethnic studies, and they are trying again to water it down, like they did with the CSU system and like they did in schools, etc. So all of these are very interconnected, and so we started thinking, how can we educate really our members on all these connections. And we start by requesting from the Council on Racial and Social Justice space for us in the equity conference that happened just before COVID at the beginning of 2020, to have panels, to talk about these issues. And we were given actually 2 panels that we were very happy to organize. And one of them was specifically focused on academic freedom, and it was titled Academic Freedom on CSU Campuses and the Rise of Right-Wing and Pro-Zionist Interest Groups. And I was part of that panel, and I did actually the introduction. I have a PowerPoint, but I don't have time to go over it, making all the connection I just talked about. And the second panel was titled Why Justice for Palestine is Central to Radical Coalition Organizing. And we had a diverse group of faculty, and we are very proud that our faculty, which is the PAM Caucus, which is the Palestine, Arab, and Muslim caucus, is very diverse. And our faculty, we have Jewish scholars, and actually our co-chair, who's the one who started the whole conversation, Janet Watson, is herself, a Jewish woman, and she belongs to the LGBT community. We have faculty who are Black, faculty who are Asian, faculty who are Muslim or non-Muslim, Arab, non-Arab, you name it. We are a very diverse group of faculty, and we are growing. And so we started with those 2 panels. I could quickly share my screen, but I don't have time to go over it. Just to give you an idea about the issues that we talked about. Just a second. This was the panel that we did, as I said, what part of my presentation. As part of the panel that I explained, I talked about all the attacks we have been receiving as students, faculty, etc. And here, this is the experience of a student who couldn't find a job because of being blacklisted. Talking about the lobby, different branches, all the money that gets all these branches, and this is only not the whole list, that goes actually into suppressing our voices and onto suppressing our academic freedom. We made all these connections. Again, unfortunately, I can't go into more details, but I gave several case studies from different CSU campuses about what was happening. And as I said, we had different faculty. We have a faculty colleague, a Black colleague who talked about his experience as a Black faculty, in support with Palestinians, etc. So after that, we started the formal process of establishing our caucus, and it took a lot of back and forth, but eventually we were very proud that we presented to the racial and the Council on Racial and Social Justice our caucus, mission and vision. And I would be more than happy to put, the link to our website shortly. And I think we got the approval in July. I can't remember the exact date. Or no, actually it was in August. We were formally informed that it was a unanimous vote by the Council on Racial and Social Justice to adopt us as a caucus. And we have building our caucus. We now have initial bylaws that we are gonna vote on during our next meeting. We have a website, we have existence. We just participated in the latest equity conference with a panel also on our different experiences, which were very diverse, as I said. And let me see, I think mainly that's mainly what I wanted to talk about, and just being very thankful to be in this space and working with everyone else. And I want to leave some space for Ali to talk about his experience.
Thank you very much. Go ahead, Ali. And Ali, you're still on mute.
Oh, okay. Okay, I think it's working. Well, I'm just going to keep it very brief. This is sort of coming full circle. Joe and Helena talked about a neoliberalism and how we can resist neoliberalism. And we've been in neoliberalism for past 40 some years. And what can, what strategies can we use to resist and transform our working conditions, as well as addressing social and racial justice issues. So I'm going to share my screens with you in the interest of time to quickly. Okay, it seems like I'm not able to share this screen. Okay, let's see. All right, can somebody help me here with the, so I can share my, okay, got it. Thank you. All right, can everyone see this? Okay, so as I mentioned, we are in, in a new liberalism, past 40 some years. Now, strikes have been a tool historically before neoliberalism, and it helped, workers, and for various other political, movements that have been effective. So I just want to begin with these two statements here. Theory is like a toolbox in the service of practice. And then the practice of strike is a powerful tool. That's my thesis one. Thesis two is workers have a right to strike, the right to stop work in order to protest oppressive working conditions. And that can be, in terms of, race, gender, sexual orientation, various other aspects of, working conditions that could be, oppressive. And the right to stop work over health and safety conditions, the right to strike over unfair labor practices, the right to strike for better pay, economic strike. So in other words, you can see that the strikes have different forms and variation in terms of, what is the the issue and what's the problem, why the strike is, as a strategy is being used. And the thesis 3, the practice of strike is in the context of power relations that are very complex. So power relations can change. Strikes are a form of exercise of power by the workers that can change power relations. And also one has to bear in mind that employers do not have absolute power over workers because of the complex, context of, relations of power. Thesis 4, it is important to become aware of power relations. Shift of power relations produce good results for workers. Strikes by unorganized non-union workers produce unions. And this has been on the rise as you pay attention to the news. You can see, Amazon workers are unionizing, Starbucks workers are unionizing, and various other organizations that they don't have unions are unionizing, which is a good news for the labor movement. So thesis 5, strike reveal power relations in practice. The practice of strike involves withholding work which employers need in order to function and produce. And this is a famous slogan that's being used, this university works because we do. And that is to say the faculty as workers. Withholding work shifts power relations. Thesis 6, it is important to be strike ready. Strike readiness and strike is a strategy to organize workers and build strength to negotiate a new and better contract. Strikes are won when workers are strong collectively, solidarity among workers is deep, and strategy is sensible and practical. So in other words, strike for the sake of strike doesn't work. You have to have a proper, plan in place. So which is the next point. The structure test used early in the process will gauge how effectively and efficiently workers agree to a public and therefore high risk actions such as striking. It can be done by survey, meeting, and discussions. Thesis 7, the threat of strike must be credible and real in order to work. The threat of strike cannot be a bluff. So hence the idea that, we have to be strike ready. If it is only a bluff, it can backfire and cause trouble. The organizing for strike must be bottom up, collective, and include rank and file members to build solidarity. So in other words, this idea is that it has to be collective and everybody should be involved. If union leaders are reluctant to strike, the workers might have to auto-organize them. Thesis 8, labor relations are relations of power between employers and workers. In order to transform power relations, workers should be strike ready at all times, which gives the workers leverage to negotiate from strength. When employers become aware that the work and productivity can be interrupted and come to a halt, then they will consider concession to the workers. Thesis 9, the successful strike is an exercise of power. It is vital to wisely assess all the forms of power or leverage the union can gather to have a successful strike. For a private sector employer, the most efficient way a strike exercises power is by limiting profits. For a public sector employer, such as universities, it is by interrupting the normal functions of public service and creating a political crisis that must be responded to. It is important to have the support of other unions, students, the public, and the public opinion in the media and social media. In other words, this whole idea of solidarity in the community is very important for any strike to be successful.
Ali, I'm so sorry to interject here for a second, but just looking at where we are on time, I was hoping I wouldn't have to do this, but I just wanted to say that, you know, where we are with kind of looking at the different things that y'all are bringing forward, I appreciate you turning our conversation to the tools as well that we have at our disposal as unions. But I'm hoping for our last chunk of time, it would be okay for us to pivot, to keep it a little bit closer to thinking about how we're using, perhaps blending into the conversation about tools with our RSJ work, and ultimately trying to bring us to a close of, you know, what we are representing here as a union today. And so I'm sorry to interject there.
That comes in my last slide, if you allow me.
Oh, go ahead.
Next, yes. So there is no illegal strike, just an unsuccessful one. Striking might be illegal in a state or sector. The workers might have to break the law. The question is, who does the law protect? The workers have to be ready and willing to break the law. It takes courage and collective solidarity to break the law. Now, this is thesis 11 that brings it all to bear here. The practice of strike at once is critique, direct action, and resistance to domination at the workplace in all forms of domination, whether it would be racial, gender, sexual orientation, various other domination. The practice of strike is the condition for the possibility of transformation that can move beyond the workplace. The practice of strike opens new political horizons, expanding the sense of what is possible when workers exercise power. Thank you.
I'm so sorry to do that. Of course, we have so much to share, and we should be ultimately having, as I think we are having in the chat, a lot of resource being shared about the broader national conversations that are happening in higher education about how workers across categories are uniting, how adjunct labor is uniting to make changes, and ultimately how the California landscape around social justice, anti-racism, decolonizing frameworks are all coming together in our union work and cannot be separated. But, since we do have such a short period of time, I actually just wanted to pull back for a second. We have tools, we have approaches, we have resources, we have active campaigns, caucus work, and all this stuff that's coming together. But a lot of things have been circling around this conference, asking the question, do you look for tracks inside the institution? Do you pursue academia? Like, why do we care about the working and learning conditions within the university? Why do we care? And I'm curious if someone wants to just offer their take on why this even matters in the scope of, our thinking about like the broader connections of education. Like, why do we really care about working and learning conditions in the academy from your perspective? Go ahead, Helena. And I saw Chris was popping up. Go ahead, Helena.
Just to get things started, I would say that that learning is collective. The kind of learning that needs to be done ASAP is collective learning, not individual learning where somebody passes a test and goes on to the next whatever. And universities are great systems for organizing people into groups. So I'll leave it at that and see what happens, see what somebody says next.
I saw Chris almost eager to jump in there. Chris, did you want to go ahead?
Sure. I will say, I think that the question of why do we care, I think you can kind of look at that at different levels and different layers, right? Like looking down at why would you as an individual person who is an educator, or why would you as an individual person as a student or staff member in higher ed care, and then thinking about it more like why would you as a member of the campus community care, and then why would you as a member of the community at large care, and then why would you, all these different kind of layers. And so I think if I start kind of at the broader level, I think that I care, I think that we should care, because if we really think about what universities do, we have a huge influence on the society at large through the education that we provide to people. It's more than just the functional dynamic of going and learning skills to take to the labor market, but it's much more about the ways in which universities can also shape kind of our thinking about who we are as a society, and thinking about the ways in which we want to solve the problems that we kind of collectively share as humanity. And not to try to make it sound too lofty, but I think that's one of the great things about having a university. We have the space to be able to engage in the research and the discourse, the interaction, to learn about a variety of things and to come up with ways to solve a variety of different kinds of problems. And so I think the university itself, the college itself, at whatever level, is important for that reason. So I think by being concerned about the conditions under which universities themselves are able to fulfill this function, I think what we're really thinking about is the health of the society at large. For thinking a little bit closer to the individual level, I think, if you're thinking as an educator, I mean, so far in my career as an educator, I've been teaching for, 24, 25 years, and I've got, many more to go. I don't, thinking about it in the long arc, I mean, who wants to sign up for 4 to 5 decades of poor treatment? That's the reality of many of us, that we actually get 4 to 5 decades of poor treatment, but we generally are not going into it for that purpose. And so part of the reason that we want to focus on these conditions under which we do our work is so that it can be sustainable. I do firmly believe that we as educators do good work in the world. I think that we have a positive impact on the community around us. I think that we have the potential for that. And I think that we need to set those conditions so that we can maximize that potential. I know that for a lot of us, people do ask sometimes, if working conditions are bad for lecturers, why do people continue to do it? And there's probably a million answers to that question, but among those million is because we have people who firmly believe in the value of our work. We believe that we're doing good things. We're doing good things for ourselves and for others. And what we do, the society benefits greatly from. And why should we stop that? Instead of stopping that, what we should do is work to create the conditions that allow that to be sustainable.
Absolutely. And so you needing to use those tools sometimes that are being drawn in at the end of y'all's presentations too, to be thinking about how we actually get those types of conditions. So Joe, we started this conversation with you. What's your take on this?
Well, this has really been stimulating. I want to say higher education, especially now, is not just universities. So the equation of university, especially from universities, and using that as a...
Oh, Joe, that beeping is on your side.
Well, I don't know what it is and I don't know where it came from. So tolerate it for a minute and I'll get off. I don't know where this is coming from. I can't figure it out. Higher ed is a huge industry. It's not just a tiny elite niche sector like it was 100 years ago. It is what the common school was in the 19th century or what high school was in the early 20th century. So that's one reason why people should care. It's a huge industry, and its potential political impact on as a big employer, and also that we work not on widgets but on human beings, is huge. Quick example, City College San Francisco at one time was the largest single community college in the country, now greatly diminished, had a penetration in San Francisco. Over 50% of the households in San Francisco had somebody in them who had been touched by City College as a student or an employee. I mean, that's hugely important, potentially, if it can be organized and directed in the direction of progressive change. That's one more reason why we should care what happens in higher education, what happens to the people who are committing the act of higher education in any respect, faculty, staff, and the students who are the direct recipients or co-producers of higher education. And I will now mute myself so we can get rid of this terrible sound.
It's kind of like a countdown timer or something, or like a little metronome with us. So David has offered that if you all do want to share in this conversation for a little bit longer, we have some flexibility in the schedule to do so. We did try to pack a lot of different topics of conversation in, but as we're kind of circling to like the general threads going through the CFA and through higher education, it does encompass a whole lot, and that impact that is there is so broad and far-reaching into our communities and our campuses. So if y'all were kind of feeling like there was something that in particular was coming up for you that you didn't have a chance to respond to, I'd like to invite you here to have that a little bit of extra space so that I'm not the sort of person but like, okay, let's churn through it and give you an opportunity to respond.
I do want to contribute something, Nicola, if I may, that I have experienced working in collaboration with the students, is that we are creating spaces at the university that then can be replicated in other parts. Obviously, we coming from community, and those spaces are created in community, bringing those experiences to the university, then allow the students to imagine that the skills and knowledge and experiences that they get at the university can then be transposed into the community when they go back and work in different spaces. And for me, there's always that reminder of, to students, like, to think about, who made it possible for you to be at the university, right? So we always acknowledge the institutions, but there is family investment, community investments that happen for those students to be able to make it to higher education. And sometimes we don't recognize their contribution and how huge of an investment it is for students to make it to higher education, knowing, the prison industrial complex, people coming from foster care, from juvenile delinquency experiences. So definitely it's a huge part. The other part is important is to instill in our students giving back, and not using the knowledge and the little paper that they get at university just to move ahead, but really think about it, how much other people gave them and invest on them, so they can do the same in their spaces and as much as they can to others. That's very, very important to do. And that only happens, and we can serve as models of that, because it's easy for us to tell students, oh, do this, do that, without really showing by example. And lastly, any other institution, their tax dollars are there for the public to benefit. And I think one of the bigger challenges that I have is to think is like, we are here trying to dismantle, capitalism and thinking about, post-capitalism structures. We don't have that yet. But yet we don't have the time to really think about and imagine what would be like a society without universities or colleges. What kind of structures we're going to create where learning happens, because obviously learning doesn't just happen in institutions, it happens outside the institutions. So our job is also to think about where learning happens and how we recognize that, and always think about bringing the example of, or my grandmother's kitchen, and how much I learned from my mother's cooking and my grandmother's love. And that is also learning, and that's also important. So that's what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, actually, Cesar, like the way that you're making that connection, I think is really important for our audience members and the people who will be viewing this video as well, because a lot of the sort of analysis around education in the summit thus far has been very transactional. Like, what do I get from this process, thinking about the piece of paper or thinking about the amount of money that you invest in it and for what? And the fact that we're using this sort of student debt burden that's being placed on students that makes them have to do this cost benefit analysis is part of the neoliberalization of higher education and the capitalized system that we're trying to break out of, right? So I really appreciate you making that connection, because I think it's so important to the theme that's running through this conference as well. But I also want to be recognizing the fact that participating in this summit and participating on this panel is also an extension of your all's labor. And so I want to be mindful of the energies that y'all are contributing to this space, and perhaps just do a quick sort of circling of our summarizing thoughts so that we can take the time that we also desperately need for ourselves, for our communities, for our families, and are able to enjoy our days as well with the breaks that we need. So some summarizing thoughts, I'll open the floor. Go ahead, Ali. Oh,
You're
and unfortunately, still on mute.
Okay. Well, I just want to clarify a couple of things here. When I began my presentation with regard to theory, I wasn't, dismissing theory. What I was trying to emphasize is that theories have to inform practice, and so because of the time that the limitation of the time, I wasn't able to get into that. And now also, strike is, as I mentioned, historically, strikes have been very effective in various forms, as not just in terms of the labor. Labor obviously is a part of that, but strikes are very important, and it can be, you can have a one-day strikes, you can have a half-a-day strikes. So for a union such as ourselves, being, aware of the tools such as strike is very important. or any kind of a movement, any social movement. So that's basically was the final analysis in the last slide that I was sharing with you guys. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And, some of these folks are contributing as well to the chat and thinking about, how do we contribute to like all of these different things, and like, why do we need these tools of striking to be able to get access sometimes when necessary to a better university? So just trying to answer into the chat some of the interest that folks have around why we do need to advocate for ourselves and how advocating for ourselves is connected to students. But I'll keep that floor open if y'all had other summarizing thoughts that you wanted to get in before the conclusion of our presentation.
I was wondering if any of the attendees have questions also, just to engage our audience a little bit more.
Yeah, it looks like people are kind of getting answers in the chat as it's rolling. So perhaps maybe what we want to do here is just continue to share some of those links for the petition, for our websites. Recognize that this is an ongoing conversation as well, and I appreciate that y'all have been rolling with things as you have been to contribute to this very rich panel with a lot of different perspectives coming together. And so perhaps we'll draw this to a close, recognizing that this is full part of a continual summit that's going to continue to explore other aspects of what has been brought forward, but recognizing the key part that education has to play in these broader conversations, and the key part that labor within higher education has to play in shaping how we do get to transforming the world around us. So thank you so much to Joe Barry.
Sorry to interrupt, but I just put the petition that that ethnic studies at the UC system is now, the faculty involved in that organizing space are asking our support if anyone is interested. So I just put the link. Sorry. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
You're great. Thank you so much. I appreciate all of our representatives here from CFA. Thank you to Joe and Helena as well for joining us in the CFA party. Thank you all for sharing your work and for the work that you are continually doing on the pathways that we're taking towards that liberation that we're all searching for. So thank you all very much for your time, and we'll see you at the next session.
Thank you.